and welcome to She Thinks, a podcast where you're allowed to think for yourself. I'm your host, Beverly Hallberg, and on today's episode, we have on IWF's Director for Center for American Safety and Security, Meaghan Mobbs. She's joining us to discuss her recent trip to the border, which spanned from Del Rio to Eagle Pass. The area is known as the epicenter of the migrant crisis. So we're going to examine the state efforts to impede unlawful crossings and the drug smuggling, and Meaghan's going to relay her conversations with those on the ground. A little bit more about Meaghan. As I mentioned, she is the director of the Center for American Safety and Security at IWF, is an experienced non-governmental policy and political leader. She previously served as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Military Academy West Point Board of Visitors and is a current gubernatorial appointee to the Virginia Military Institute Board of Visitors. Meaghan, always a pleasure to have you on She Thinks.
Thanks, Beverly. It's great to be back.
And it's good to talk with somebody who has been on the ground and saw many miles of what's going on the border. You were on this trip with the Center for Immigration Studies, and you toured quite a bit of the border. How many miles is the pass from Del Rio to Eagle Pass? And was this your first time there?
Oh, you're going to ask me a mile question. By the way, I'm terrible at distances, so I should know that offhand. And honestly, I don't know. I mean, it's quite a long distance. I mean, there's quite a large portion that we traversed during our time there. And thank you for kind of giving that shout out to Center for Immigration Studies, who really helped facilitate this trip and make it possible. And I think the reason why they did what we did, which was really start in San Antonio, and then we moved down to the border and through all these different communities, was to see the impact as far reaching. I mean, it's all over the United States, but also to see that it cascades up to San Antonio. And it's not just right on the border that where Americans are impacted. And so I think actually starting there and then moving down and then traversing that long portion and actually going into Mexico, we crossed over into Mexico as well, was a really important part for all of us to see.
And when it comes to the protections that we have, so we think of fences, we think of border walls, we think of areas that don't have anything. What did you see in terms of that? And has it been different depending on who's been president and how they've handled securing the border?
Yeah, and this actually, I took a video because it was so striking that there was kind of the juxtaposition of three different fences that were erected during three different presidencies. So there was kind of, the George W. Bush fence, the Obama era fence, and then the Trump fence, and then really there's like no Biden fence. I mean, it's like this like chain link thing. And I think ultimately it really is actually, it isn't necessarily about the politics of it. I think it's the reality of the situation on the ground, which was very important for me to see. But it is so extraordinarily striking when you see what you can tell is a very, very significant barrier that was built under the Trump administration. It's inscalable, impenetrable. You can't get through, you can't get over, you can't dig down just because the virtue of the size of it. And previously, you had the kind of George W. Bush, Obama era fence. It was kind of basically the same across those two administrations. It was a little robust. I mean, it was a taller fence, a little bit more structured. And you can actually see these videos, I think, on IWF right now. But then you go to where the kind of current administration has tried to put up roadblocks. And it's actually the ones that we were looking at were put in place post the incident with the 17,000 Haitian migrants coming up to Texas. And so purposely, I think the Biden administration realized if they stopped the Trump wall, they had to do something. But their something was, I mean, effectively the kind of chain link fence you see around parks, for example. Very easy to scale, very easy to cut. And actually there was a portion where it was cut and like patched over multiple times where you could see people had just opened and come on through. And so there are those, right? Those are the kind of the federal protections that we have, those different walls, if you will, or fences. But then really a big portion of what we saw was what was put in place by Governor Abbott, the governor of Texas, under Operation Lone Star. And ultimately the governor has recently decided that if the federal government was not going to protect our borders or protect Texas in particular, then he was going to, under his constitutional authority in Texas, under the Texas Constitution, he was going to kind of take matters into his own hand. And what that became is Operation Lone Star. And there was all that kind of big news about this because he was putting the barriers in the water and he was putting all these connexes. They kind of took over Shelby Park, which is on the border, to ensure that these migrant crossings that were happening where there was no wall at least had some level of protection. And actually, Governor Abbott is actually using state funding to now begin building and kind of adding on to the Trump era wall using state funds and not federal funds.
And do you find that most people on the ground, Texans, are supportive of Governor Abbott using state funds to do this?
I will say it's kind of taking away the politics of it. I think it's important because I think there is still, in that particular area of Texas in particular, it's kind of historically Democrat. I think what they all agree on is that this crisis of what's happening is affecting everyone. It's affecting every American, regardless of what political party, regardless of socioeconomic status. It is genuinely having an impact on communities. And that was one of the biggest things that I found so striking, was that no matter where we went, whether we met with a church group or whether we were at a school or whether we were meeting with emergency services or ranchers, I mean, we met with a really wide swath of people. To a person, they all talked about how it was impacting their daily lives. And I think a really good example of this is we were in a small town and we were talking about emergency medical services. And this town, in fact, had one ambulance, one emergency medical service crew. And obviously, if it's taken up by someone, then they have to wait for a neighboring town from like Uvalde or someone to send their emergency medical services. And they told the story of a woman, an American citizen who had a stroke. Unfortunately, the EMS services, the ambulances, was actually being utilized by an undocumented migrant. And as a result, they had to wait an hour for an ambulance to come from Uvalde to care for this woman who just had a stroke. And as a result, she died. And that is the kind of real world impact these communities are seeing. It is about resources. There are not enough resources in these small communities to manage the American citizens that exist there, let alone a massive influx of non-citizens that then eat up all of those resources that were already sparse to begin with. And so I would say that whether or not they agree with Abbott or Lone Star, I think what they all agree on universally is that this cannot continue, that it's not sustainable and it's not good for any American.
Well, it's the number one issue for Americans is what's going on the border, even more than the economy, which says everything that you need to know. That's both Republicans and Democrats and independents. They are all concerned. And we do hear about these large numbers. You mentioned the Haitians crossing over, but can you break down this year compared to last year? Like, how bad is it? How bad is it getting?
So it's actually interesting. We're seeing, I'm going to call it a slowdown, but I mean, to take that lightly because it's still at historic highs, right? So it's a slowdown from last year. And some of the conversations that we had with Border Patrol Union and with other law enforcement attribute this to the kind of slowdown to this intense, all of a sudden, focus on the border, and that there was some level of agreement between Obrador, Mexican president, and Biden about really making sure they were cleaning up the kind of optics of what was happening on the border. And because Operation Lone Star did impact the ability of migrants to cross in Texas, they've now shifted down, right? They've moved their operations down to Arizona and down to California. And so you're seeing lower numbers now, but you are seeing kind of the epicenter shift of where people are attempting or trying to cross. Additionally, you have this CBP-1 app, which is this app that was put in place by the Biden administration, which allows anyone from their phone to apply for asylum or parole into the United States. And they are using that in kind of mass droves. So even if we have, and I think this is where it's really important to discuss, right? It's not just, when we say illegal crossing, there are the ones that are known by Border Patrol or known by law enforcement who either caught or go through the legal, or I would say like a managed routes to get into the US, like through the actual border checkpoints or through CBP-1, meaning we know who they are. And then there are others that are gotaways that come into the country and we have no idea who they are. They aren't on anyone's radar. They haven't filed through the CBP-1 app. They are not on Border Patrol anywhere. And that is, I think, a really important number to talk about because that number is astronomically high. We have an estimate, right? There are the known unknowns and the known knowns, but we have an idea that there's probably 3 million that we have no idea over the last 3 years that are in the US. And the reason why that is so important is because, and again, to a person, we heard that this is a different kind of group of migrants coming through, and by which I mean country of origin. It is a different group coming through. They're coming from places like Syria and Belarus and Iran and Iraq and Russia and China. And it's not to say those are all totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. Many are probably escaping for a better life. And it is reasonable to assume that there is a portion of them that are not looking for a better life, that are absolutely looking to undermine the United States. Sure. And that's reflected in some ending up on the terrorist watch list that got released into our communities.
Well, let me ask you about some of the migrants who are crossing. For many of them, the plan is to be captured. Isn't that the typical game plan? And what are they usually looking for? Is a certain type of official for a better chance of that? How are they being coached?
So in tech, so first off, I think that I'll get back to the coaching portion because I think that's really important to understand how much of this is being orchestrated. This isn't like tinfoil hat conspiracy. It truly is being orchestrated by a number of different groups and people and organizations. But the migrants coming up now through Texas have recognized is that if they are apprehended by Texas law enforcement under Operation Lone Star, that they're going to be arrested because Texas law enforcement does not have the authority that Border Patrol does to kind of take them into kind of humanitarian custody and then process them for releasing pending their asylum or parole. So what they're being coached on is you look for a green uniform, you don't look for a tan uniform. And so you will have migrants that will come up and then they will wait until all the tan uniforms, which is Texas law enforcement, move along or get off shift, and then they will purposefully seek out and look for a Border Patrol or a green uniform in order to get taken into custody so they have the opportunity to get processed and then paroled or released into the United States. Because what's happening is part of this whole process is one of the questions that are asked as you're screening is, do you have the kind of fear for your life back in your home country? And of course they're going to say yes. Like that's what they're coached to say. They say yes. And then there's no follow-up. There's no time to do any type of questioning or investigation. And so as a result, if they say yes, then they are under our current policy, they are then granted the opportunity for a court hearing. The problem is court hearings are scheduled 2031, 2035, and they have to wait in the United States until that date comes along. So then they are released into our communities until that court date can occur. So that's why they are specifically looking for those green uniforms so they can get that opportunity to get paroled here into the US and then wait 5, 10 years for their actual court date.
What I think is interesting in some of the notes that you sent over about your trip, you met with a federal judge just in terms of the patterns that they are seeing. And it sounds like Americans are getting in on the side hustle of transporting people over. They're seeing this as a financial benefit to them to bring people over. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we heard this from a number of people actually that there really is this kind of like parallel or side economy that's occurring alongside the migration crisis, and this makes sense, right? If you have an influx of people, then those people need something. They need transportation, they need food. These facilities that are being set up in order to process all the historically high levels of migrants need security. So there has to be all of these Uber rides, right? All of these things that we don't necessarily consider. And so as a result, there's a little bit of kind of like self-licking ice cream cone portion by which we really want to get rid of it. And yet it's also sustaining a lot of people. And so Americans don't want it to necessarily go away in some places. And one of those is this transportation. So it used to be predominantly men who, and by transporters, sorry, I guess I should clarify what that means. It means when someone illegally comes across, oftentimes they have a destination somewhere else in the United States they want to get to, another city, another place, either a family member or a friend. And so they need transportation to get there. And so these are what these transporters do. And this is a federal crime, by the way. But they will kind of coordinate and pick up illegal migrants to transport them to their final destination. And they get paid by head a lot of money. $2,000, $5,000. These transporters used to be predominantly men. It's now about 50% women. And they're getting recruited, not just women, but men as well, are getting recruited via social media. That's how they're getting kind of groomed for it, kind of recruited, and that's how they're getting all of their information.
And I want to talk about something that is referred to as bailouts. This is also part of the strategy when somebody illegal is coming over to avoid capture. What is a bailout?
So this goes back to what I was talking about with gotaways. There are some migrants that are coming, and you said this earlier, Beverly, that they want to be caught. They want to be caught. They want to be processed so that they can get released and kind of allow the clock to start ticking. But also because there are some cities that are providing quite a number of what I will call incentives or pull for these migrants to come, whether it's rooms in hotel rooms, cell phones, cards for them to work permits, things like that. So there are some that that's what they're going for, and that's what they're going to do. They've been coached to do that either by friends here or again via social media to do exactly that. But then there are some who have very nefarious purposes for being here. They are not coming to be an economic contributor to the US. They are not necessarily coming for the shining light on the hill. They are coming to make money via the cartels. So trafficking, whether it's drugs or whether it's humans, or they don't like America. They want to destabilize America, and also obviously gun running and weapons running. But so these are gotaways. These are the ones that absolutely do not, under any circumstances, want to be caught, because if they're caught, they'll, backgrounds could get checked, a red flag would go up, and then they would lose the opportunity to either make money or do whatever it is they were to try to do in the US. So they will bail out. And by bail out, it means exactly what it sounds like. They will bail out of the vehicle that they're in to try to evade capture. But one of the techniques they've started doing is doing it during the day in school zones. And that's because they know that during those school zones, one, high-speed chases are not as likely, because the local law enforcement certainly do not want to get into a high-speed chase in a school zone because of all the risks you might imagine, but also because if they bail out in front of a school, then they can go through that community, that neighborhood, even that school sometimes, in order to evade capture. And so schools, local schools, elementary schools, are going through lockdowns when this happens. Wow. When a bailout occurs, they go through lockdowns. And that obviously prevents, that's obviously psychologically impactful on the children and the teachers, but it also interrupts learning and also kind of disrupts the sense of safety and security and community in these areas. So this goes back to, it is affecting from the woman who has a stroke at the kind of later years in her life to the very school children in these communities. They are being impacted by what's occurring at the border.
I think what's so surprising is that we've seen this happen month after month after month, year after year. It's so bad and everybody agrees, but yet it's still happening. Why is it still happening? I know, of course, we can look to whether or not our laws are being enforced in the Biden administration. But what do you think the solution is? And just kind of a follow-up question on that as well. You going down there and seeing it for yourself, is it worse than you even thought?
So, okay, I will go backwards. Yes, it is worse than I thought. Honestly, it was one of those things that I kind of was like, I'm a very much, I got to see for myself kind of person. I also think just the rhetoric around immigration and border security and all of that can get so heated and so partisan, but I think it's really important. And this is why I love the work that you do, Beverly. Like, people need to understand for themselves and make decisions. And I think when they're presented with facts, or they're presented with these images or these stories, I think that allows them to really understand the totality of what's occurring. And so I'm the kind of person where I want to see it for myself. So it was, again, super grateful for Center for Immigration Studies for allowing me to participate in this experience with them. I wasn't prepared to hear how significantly it was impacting everyday average Americans. I think there was this episode, I think it was MSNBC, and then there was a panel discussion, and they were talking about the comment somebody made about every city is now a border city, and they all kind of chuckled about oh, why would people in Virginia care about immigration? And I think that's, for people that are maybe far away or not experiencing this, I could see how they could feel disconnected. But then being there and recognizing, well, it's actually not just Texas or Arizona or California, that many of these, and we actually went to and stood outside a facility that housed thousands of these migrants, they're getting bused or flown to cities all across America. And so that impact we're seeing in those small communities, it is going to eventually impact other cities and other places. And we're starting to see that, where places like community centers in Denver, for example, kids can't use them because they've been converted to migrant facilities. And so I wasn't prepared, I think, to hear the personal stories of that and how that's impacted people and their lives and their livelihoods. I mean, especially the ranchers. I mean, that was really hard to hear. I mean, their fences get cut, their livelihood, their livestock will run off. There's no recourse. No one's held accountable or responsible for that. So it was way worse than I imagined. That was a long way of answering. Way worse than I imagined. And I think this goes what you said almost immediately. So we have to enforce the laws we have on the books. That is a very simple way to just immediately stop what's occurring. And that's where I think, that obviously the lots of discussion over the bill in Congress and the bipartisan immigration bill and what that looked like, and border security. I think that there is time and plenty of discussion to be had around how do we fix things related to humanitarian parole or asylum, or how we look at migration and how we look at taking immigrants. That discussion absolutely needs to be had. I think kind of post-Reagan 1986, when he thought he was fixing immigration, perhaps that was maybe not one of the things he ended up fixing or doing very well. Definitely some discussion needs to be had. But while we have that discussion, which should happen now, and that's Congress's responsibility, our executive can do something immediately to stem the tide. And I'm unsure. I'm unsure why that's not happening.
Well, you
I
mentioned that they have been starting to put up a fence. Now that's chain link. This is not something that's highly secure.
yeah.
With the increased pressure, and you can see the polling for itself. Do you see the Biden administration? Not only have they changed their rhetoric some, they're now calling it a crisis when they didn't for the longest time. But do you see them stepping up in enforcement in any way, or how migrants who are
Mhm.
processed are treated?
I think it's more of like the game that we played as kids, right? Where you put like the ball under a cup, there's 3 cups, and then you shifted them around so nobody knew where they were. It
Right.
feels like that. It feels like we don't want the optics of a Haitian migrant caravan again. We don't want the optics of what was happening at Eagle Pass back in like the fall time frame. So now they are more trying to more rapidly process people through. Obviously, that's extraordinarily dangerous, right? Because if you rapidly process people through, then you have no idea. You can't do the necessary background checks. So what they're doing is doing just that. They're trying to rapidly process people through, so there's not the optics of people sitting on the border. They're flying them to all these different cities or busing them to these different cities. So there's now not again a kind of a group or a large kind of complement of them anywhere. But that's actually not. It's not fixing anything. It just is hiding it from the American people.
Got
And
it.
I do think they're doing that because they're quite frightened by the poll numbers. I think that's part of it. I think it's part of why Blinken and Biden had the conversation with Obrador. Mexico, I think there's an article in Reuters that just came out yesterday about how Mexico is going to try to step it up. I mean, I think Mexico is a little fearful of what might happen if this becomes truly an election issue, because the Remain in Mexico policy was super effective under the Trump
Yeah.
administration, super effective. And I'm not sure they want to return to that. I think that they are kind of okay because there's a lot of money being made right now, and it's no shock to anyone to hear about the cartels, right? The drug cartels that are funneling and doing a lot of this. But there's a lot of corruption in Mexico, and some of the cartels in some places aren't the drug cartels; they are the state agency. So, state agency has like literally the Mexican state, not the kind of whole country, but there's individual Mexican states. Sometimes it is that state agency that is responsible for funneling money. And so there's substantial government corruption. And so I think, so again, some of this is a bit of a shell game. They're trying to move it around while not changing anything, not changing any policy, actually not improving the situation. They're just trying to help adjust the numbers and the optics of the problem.
Yeah. And are you seeing that there could be a massive influx of people trying to cross the border to do this before the November elections, just in case Trump may win the presidency? Are they
Mhm.
trying to make a mass dash for the border to
Yeah.
try to get in?
I think that there is the fear that's coming. And I think that's why kind of Mexico right now, and I think the administration changing their rhetoric a little bit is hopefully trying to stave off that potentiality. Because I think they are very fearful that that's going to occur. There's going to be this mad dash or mad rush towards the border. And this goes back to kind of what we were saying just a little bit earlier about why this is happening in such volumes right now. It is because the rhetoric previously was kind of like, come, open gates, anybody can make it here. So, of course, people are going to say, great, then I'm going to do that. They also hear back from their friends or their family members that make it into the US, right? We would do the same thing. We would call our family member and be like,
Right.
time to come is now. Absolutely. Go ahead and do it. This is how I did it. So that kind of had that chain effect. And then also there are incentives right now. There is these kind of pull factors, especially in these sanctuary cities, which by the way, I hate that term. Nobody wants to be against sanctuary, right? It's like a lovely term. Compassionate people want to be like, of course we want sanctuary. It doesn't provide sanctuary for anyone. It doesn't provide sanctuary for the migrants, really. And it certainly doesn't provide any sanctuary for the American citizens living in those cities. But in some of those places, they're required to give them a place to stay, like a hotel room or a work permit. And so then again, those are pull incentives that are driving people to come because why would they not?
And so, final question for you. I think a lot of people listening to this probably get even more concerned when they hear from somebody who's been there on the ground near the border and see what's actually taking place. Of course, people can vote. Anything else for people to do?
I think there's some great people that are reporting constantly on the border that I really just the facts. It really is. They give numbers, they give data. Bill Malusian from Fox has been there consistently talking about this, and he really got. They just did I think a FOIA that looked at where all of these migrants are getting flown to. So that came out yesterday to show the numbers going to certain cities. So he's someone great to keep really relevant information on. Todd Bensman, great reporter also through CIS, and then IWF is coming out with an immigration update policy focus in June. So I would ask everybody, like, pay attention, make sure you're getting the facts, keep yourself informed, and then come back in June to IWF and read that policy focus.
Absolutely. And we so appreciate not just your time to go to the border, but also to write about it, to come on and talk about it. We really appreciate your work. Meaghan Mobbs, Director of the Center for American Safety and Security at IWF. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beverly.
And thank you all for joining us. Before you go, IWF does want you to know that we rely on the generosity of supporters like you. An investment in IWF fuels our efforts to enhance freedom, opportunity, and well-being for all Americans. So please consider making a small donation to IWF by visiting iwf.org/donate. That's iwf.org/donate. Last, if you enjoyed this episode of She Thinks, do leave us a rating or review. It does help. And we'd love it if you shared this episode so your friends can know where they can find more She Thinks. From all of us here at IWF, thanks for watching.